poor, between educated and uneducated, and between like white, black men, women. And what is so important about it is that we are building an advantage there for people who know somebody who did something. And so we are giving advantage to people who know somebody else who did something, and they have to tell something bad about him, or they can tell something bad about it. So, no, thank you. And who are these people? Usually, these are these particularly like bad, unsavory criminals, like usually deeply embedded in criminal organizations. These are the people who are already in there, and we think that this is the incentive there goes really in a false direction, because people who are rewarded, kind of, who are actually already in really deeply in this kind of crime organization. And what is so important in that point is that we won't never make any difference between somebody having more knowledge or less knowledge on something that really doesn't concern the subject of why this person shall be punished. There's no connection between him knowing something about somebody else and him being punished for a certain crime. Your question.
Isn't actually the willingness to testify against criminals something that is a good deal for society, and shouldn't people be rewarded for doing that?
Well, we see that no, thank you. We see that there is a benefit for maybe for society, but we don't see any connection between somebody being punished for something he did and somebody knowing something else about another person. So we don't want to connect that. We don't want to reward him in giving him less reduce the sentence. So that's really not what the incentive should be in this case. Next, I want to talk about this false testimony. So we think that these people, and we are talking about criminals here, if these people see like, oh, okay, I get 10 years, but if I blame somebody for something, I get 5 years off. So then they might just blame anybody for having done anything without really telling the truth. So, but the problem is, there is not just no good effect, but there is a really bad effect. But for example, if he's not just not telling the truth about somebody who did something, but he's always also lying about somebody else, and this person will have really bad, will of course suffer from that, and in the end it leads us away from finding the real criminals by giving these false incentives who are leading to false testimonies, and because these people are just criminals who might just do anything to get reduced sentences. No, thank you. My third point, which is really important, is to talk about these principles again and why we do not give on principles in general. So we've got a lot of principles in our society, and we hold them really high. Like, for example, if we know that there is a gun in somebody's room and we know that this gun might have caused a murder, we just still don't just step in there and take it out, but we have these principles. We have to go to, the police needs a sheet who tells them that they are allowed to get in. We can't just go randomly because even though there might be some pragmatic short-run benefits, in the long term it has a better outcome to just follow these principles. So. Of course, often principles are disturbing, but we still hold them high. Like, we have got freedom of speech, we've got these principles, this example I talked about, that might sometimes stand in the way of pragmatic effects, but we still hold them high because it's always better to have these principles. They form order, and that they enable our social context to work. So, like, it gives us the security that, for example, the state is not abusing power, that we don't get into these slippery slope kind of things, that we allow something one time and then another time something more happens. We all know how it works. So we say by holding high these principles, even though there might be some bad effects on the long run, we still have a huge benefit because we've got that order, we've got that security, that we don't have any, there is no abusion by any actor in our society, so that's why we really hold these principles high. So what did we show you from first government now? We show you that everybody shall be equal in front of the law and shouldn't have any advantages by talking about something that doesn't have anything to do with the subject. We don't want to have false testimonies which lead us away from the real criminals and from the subject, and we won't never give up the principles, so that's why we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I come to my own points, which will mainly be about how this deal we see here going on between prosecutors and people who have been sentenced, which is mainly about how this is having practical implications and also morally implications. I'm going on a lot further on that in my own points. I want to do some destructive against the points Marijiana just brought up. So we were hearing here that it is a false incentive to kind of reward people for this if they just know someone, and that this is unfair. We believe that this is not the case here. This is not a point that can be held up here, because it is exactly the right incentive, because it is something that actually is beneficial towards society, that actually is coinciding with goals of society. I'm going on a lot further in my own points into that one, but we see that this is not a wrong reward, like Matthias showed you in his question already. Also, it has a practical impact. I will go on further into that, but it makes it possible to find out a lot more about crimes we might never actually have found out about without this kind of cooperation here. So this is also a beneficial effect this would have. Then Marijiana had the big kind of scare putting up here that we might just kind of give them the incentive to blame anybody just in order to have lesser charges. We don't believe that is how status quo works. It's not like a prosecutor is going there and says, so, do you know anything about anybody because you can get a lesser charge? This is actually only happening if there's a strong suspicion, if we actually already know that this kind of people are involved, no thank you, within like organized crimes or this kind of complex crimes where it is very hard to actually find out who is also responsible for the crime we are seeing here that might have been doing all that we just found out about this one individual here, but that is actually a lot more complex. All right, your question, John.
Isn't it even worse if the prosecutor says, well, don't you know anything about Matthias that you can tell us that's particularly bad? Because we're really interested in Matthias. Don't you have an incentive to say something about Matthias, even if you've never even really met Matthias before?
No, we don't believe so, because first of all, it will have to be proven that there's any kind of realistic suspicion behind this, and also, as I said, it is just being used when you have a strong suspicion already, when you see that there's some kind of complex criminal systematic, and you kind of know maybe through other sources that this individual might have something to do with that, and that you can get a beneficial information out of it. Also, there was a lot being talked about, why do we have punishment? And that actually works very well with my own points I want to make now, which is going into the moral implications of this deal we would actually hold up and would not be let down as proposition supposes here. So the moral implications, okay? We see that in our society there's some kind of system, there's some kind of process that is in relation to punishment in a sentence kind of way. So how does this actually work? We believe that a society kind of puts up generally accepted moral boundaries within which the society is working, is evolving, is functioning. So those moral boundaries we have all accepted on within one society. Those are actually the boundaries where we believe, or that we believe are important, are crucial for society to flourish in, for society to work in, to just have a good kind of living environment. If someone oversteps those boundaries we put up, if someone actually goes out of that morally boundary kind of place we kind of put up in society, where we can like move within society, then this is when the punishment, or when our criminal justice system starts, when punishment is being put on. Because we say there are two main points why we have punishment. There's firstly, no thank you, to get retribution, but also to reintegrate, because we believe that we don't just want to put someone into jail for just like not being there anymore, but it is actually, as I said, for retribution, but also for him to hopefully understand what was wrong, to not do this in future again, to reintegrate him after this sentence into our society. And what we believe on a metaphorical, no thank you, on a metaphorical kind of basis this is, the person who is being punished here stepped out of those borders we were putting up within society. So the punishment is the process which should help us to bring him back within those borders, which should help him or her to get back within those boundaries, moral boundaries of society. So we believe that if we actually can get him to cooperate with us and to do something that is beneficial for society, he actually comes a lot closer towards those boundaries, moral boundaries of this specific society. And in combination with the sentence he will still get, because we're not just taking away all of his charges, right? We are just like maybe lessening them in some kind of deal. We believe that this process is not being stopped. I will take in a minute. This process is not being stopped, but it's just kind of being put, or just kind of working out in a different kind of way. Your question.
But a person does that not because he's a moral human being, but because out of his self-interest. It is fundamentally different if I give money to a homeless man because I'm kind, or because I want him to get out of my way.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I actually have that on my sheet. I almost forgot it. So even if that individual does this only out of egoistic kind of reasons, firstly, we believe, hey, that perfectly fits within society, no? Because he acts like a true capitalist. And also, we believe that this is great because it shows that his egoistic kind of goals actually coincide with the goals of society again. So can't we have like any better integration at this point? So what did I show you today? I showed you that the point Marijiana brought up is not standing for their side, her point that why do we have punishment? It's actually standing for our side, because punishment is this kind of process to reintegrate individuals within those moral boundaries we actually all accepted within society, so that society can function, and that this process is not being stopped through status quo, where you can actually have those kind of deals between the prosecutor and the people who are being prosecuted, but it's just kind of being lived out in a different way, being worked out in a different way. We showed you that those moral implications we have here, and Matthias will show you a lot more about the practical implications this deal can have, the beneficial kind of outcomes it has for society, and for all of those reasons, we really beg you to oppose with us today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to begin this speech by rehashing some of our own material and expanding it in looking at the kind of way in which this particular actor, the prosecutor, is the wrong person to be determining if there's some kind of
mitigating factor that's actually happening here and that should be taken into consideration. We think we have a position in our legal system that actually does this. It's called the judge, and we don't think that the prosecutor in the kind of position that he's in should be doing this. We're going to look at each and every one of these kinds of reasons for why we punish and show you how Chrissy's analysis actually doesn't really fit in any kind of way and how we win each and every one of these. And then we're going to look a little bit about kind of principles and why in our society, even if we do buy the fact that, like Matthias says, there are little atomized benefits over the course of, or throughout our entire society. If we're going to do this, we think that by losing the kind of principles that form the foundation of our working together and form the foundation of our societies, we actually lose a lot more than we gain. So let's look at, they kind of concede the fact that there is a legitimacy to this person being punished, right? This person did something wrong, and this person, for some reason, for these 4 reasons or 5 reasons, actually should go to jail for what it is that they did. By simply testifying, by simply saying something about something I had seen, something I had heard, probably in the course of a crime I was committing or somebody I was dealing with who's also a particularly bad actor, we don't necessarily think you at this phase in your sentencing actually mitigate any of that guilt. We think that guilt, whatever reason we have here, we have the rehabilitation. We don't think you're going to be rehabilitated any better at the point where you're saying, I am not going to give you this information. I don't want to participate fully in society by kind of sharing the information I have unless there's a quid pro quo, unless you give me something. We don't think you're turning into that better person. We don't think you're making those baby steps toward rehabilitation like Chrissy says, because we think you're actually a very self-centered, selfish actor in this kind of sense. You're not showing that kind of willingness to participate without any kind of quid pro quo. We think that this idea of protection of society is also extremely important in this case. If we've determined that it's good to keep this person away from society until he's actually changed his life, he or she has actually changed their lives, we think it's particularly important because they're actually even worse criminals to the extent that they're deeply embedded in these kind of criminal organizations. They have inside knowledge of something that, as Matthias and Chrissy have said, is very important to the prosecutor. So it's probably some higher level dealings. It's not just kind of low level, maybe marijuana on the street, but it's something larger that they're involved in. So we think that protection of society is also particularly important in this case. We think that they haven't talked about this and they really haven't dealt with it. So getting to the third idea of deterrence, Chrissy also hasn't really taken this into consideration, the fact that people are going to be able to have this trump card in their back pocket and say, well, even if they get me, right, I know character X who's also involved in drugs, or also involved in this rape that happened last year. I can always turn him in because I know the police are interested in him. I can do whatever it is I want until that particular point. We think that that's particularly important here, and they don't discuss it at all. This plea bargain doesn't actually remove any of that kind of doesn't actually remove deterrence as a reason for punishing this kind of person. We think closure of the victims is as Marijiana said, it's something that's particularly important in a lot of ways, that we see maybe a child getting killed or something happening that's terrible, and this person, because he's a particularly bad person, getting less of a crime or less of a sentence than some other person who may be just not know the kind of inside information that he does know. We think in general this principle of equality in front of the law is something that's particularly important. I'm going to get to that in this kind of last point that we have. But before I get into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea now about mitigation. And they try to attach this idea of testimony to these 4 reasons for punishment. That they're saying that, well, the rehabilitation as a reason for punishment is now somehow affected by my testimony. I've showed you why this is not the case, and why the prosecutor actually has a particular interest, and I said in my POI, has a particular interest very often in one person, and it leads to kind of misleading information. We think that the prosecutor shouldn't be the one to be giving out this kind of thing. In the time preceding the actual sentencing. We think there are mechanisms for determining if there's aggravating or mitigating circumstances to a sentencing, and we think that the judge is the person who's currently doing this. We think the judge is also the better person to actually do this. We think that there's nothing that, if we do not allow prosecutors to give out lightened sentences for prearranged testimony. We think that even if you testify just of your own free will and say, I know all of these things, I would like to help society, like Chrissy said, I would like to begin to rehabilitate myself, I would like to do all of these things without the promise that I'm going to get out. We think judges should probably take this into consideration. We think judges are particularly the exactly correct people to take this into consideration, because you also get less of a chance of misuse. You get less of a chance of a prosecutor saying, I need to solve this case because it's particularly politically motivated. The mayor's son was killed, so I need this case solved. I need case Y solved. I need to solve this particular kind of cases. Or I need to solve this case because it's a white man in a black neighborhood and not vice versa. So I want to solve this particular kind of case, and for that reason, I invest a lot of my capital. I even say, I'm going to let this particularly bad person go in this prearranged situation before I actually come to sentencing. We think that that's fundamentally wrong. We think that prosecutors, even though they are kind of motivated by these kinds of things, shouldn't be, and they shouldn't be the kinds of people to cut these kinds of deals. We think judges are significantly more neutral in this kind of respect, because they are looking at this in retrospect. They're able to see and able to actually adjudicate the fact whether this was an act of contrition, whether this was something that shows the first step to rehabilitation or not. Okay, very sorry. So what does this actually lead to? This leads to this kind of idea that we have the principles in our society that must be held up very often at the expense of short-term benefits. So we say, there's a consensus that neo-Nazis are not really a good thing, right? But we allow certain demonstrations to take place because we say the principle of free speech and the things that underlie that principle of free speech that enables our society to function well is more important than this one particular case. We say search and seizure is also the very same thing. We can know to a certain amount of certainty that something is in an apartment, that something is in a car, that something is in a locker, and say, we're not going to search it without some kind of search warrant, and if the judge says no, then we're not going to search it under any kind of situation, because we think that the principles of not allowing our state or our society to turn into the kind of place where we have arbitrary rules and have arbitrary applications for short-term pragmatic benefits, we think that we get a better society in the end. We think that these kind of atomized benefits that Matthias is probably going to bring to you don't actually lead to the kind of societal benefits that we get on our side of the house. For all these reasons, we proudly propose.
Yes, thank you very much for the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to start with this idea about rehabilitation, some rebuttal. The main idea that brought forward by John here right now about the judges being the better suited person for approving such deals or something like that, and then come to my own constructive points, which mostly will deal with the practicality of this and how crime has actually changed and how we can capture some criminals and find actually some crimes we would never know about otherwise that are very fundamental and threaten the stability of our societies. But let's get started by this idea of rehabilitation. I'm going to bring the extreme case of this whole deal making, which is the whistleblower who gets off free for simply exposing a crime that nobody ever knew about. And we believe in these cases many times there are people who are under the moral pressure actually, who actually are rehabilitated by the time they go to someone, they offer up their information, and we think that's a very nice example where that actually works. We also feel that even if these are just egoistic people doing it for their own benefit, firstly, as Chrissy said, they're good capitalists. They're doing something, and it's also good for society. It's the invisible hand of the criminal justice system in a way, you could say. But more than that, actually, just by going through the motions, just behaving as if you were a good person, we believe is the learning effect in of it by itself, and you will have some sort of benefit gained there as a person. Some learning will have to happen there. Now, then the main idea, and I think it's mostly hair-splitting, if prosecutors are the one who are the rightly suited for that, or judges are the one, then we would just like to clear up. There are many jurisdictions it's actually the prosecutors that offer these deals, but then they have to be approved by a judge afterwards, which would be perfectly fine for us. We don't really care either way. We don't see that much of a difference really between judges and prosecutors. Now, two more things, the false testimony aspect. I want to briefly go to that, and I think Chrissy has already shown to you very nicely that there's a standard of proof for criminal prosecution, which is just beyond a reasonable doubt. And we're not changing that standard of proof just because recourse to some testimony. Maybe some people will get annoyed if there is false testimony, but if the system works, and it is, and we have to trust that it works, then no innocent persons are going to end up behind jail because of that. And then this whole idea of principles. Well, we are for principles too, and their main principle seems to be like equality. And we're saying, you know, equality should only be there for things that are actually equal. And there's a difference between committing a crime with somebody else and never exposing that guy to the criminal justice system and to punishment, and doing it. So there's a difference between these two modes of action, and that should be recognized in the punishment you receive. Now, to get to my own matter, the practical idea, you know, the idea is to catch bad guys, obviously. It's the whole idea of the criminal justice system, is it not?
So, if I understood you correctly, if benefits of some action outweigh the cost, you're in favor of that?
I didn't really get that, but yes, you know, there is a benefit that I will show you now by people testifying against others, and they should be rewarded for that benefit. Now, as I said, we want to catch bad guys. That's a good thing. I think I don't need to tell you too much. Why is it good? Because it's preventative. It increases the likelihood of being caught and punished for these people. And we don't think, as John here said, that it's like a get-out-of-jail-free card or something like that. Because firstly, there's only one person in an organization that has that card, actually can draw that card. Secondly, it's not absolute. You don't get out free usually. And you know, the whole case of the prisoner's dilemma, which I don't have the time to explain, but if you know that kind of scenario from game theory, that whole, you know, it's based on this deal making, and it's a prisoner's dilemma, so these people are actually in that dilemma. It's a bad thing for them. Now, so it's a, you know, it raises the expectation of punishment for wrongdoing, and therefore acts as a deterrent. I want to talk about the types of crimes we are talking about. There are very specific crimes where these kinds of deals make much more sense than in others. For example, murder is not one of them. In murder prosecution, you usually have physical evidence, you know, that a bullet, a gun, fingerprints, all that kind of things. Now, what we are talking about here mostly are complex crimes, crimes that happen in the shadows of our societies, crimes we might not even know about. For example, organized crime. Now, in organized crime, there simply mostly is no physical evidence, because at least not to prosecute the top guys, because they are never get, they don't kill any people, they never get in a room with the drugs or anything like that. So you actually can't get to them any other way, really. They're careful, you know, they don't talk on the phone or anything anymore. They've all seen The Wire. No, thank you. So really, the only way to get to them is to get their underlings to talk about them, to tell on them. So, and organized crime, obviously a problem. Now it's, you know, everything is getting globalized, including crime. There's white-collar crime, too. You know, white-collar crime is sometimes so complex. You could look at the books of some companies, and you wouldn't know that they're actually trading drugs or whatever, because these people, there's sometimes just an asymmetry of the skill level these people have versus the prosecutors. We don't have much good prosecutors for crime in business and finance markets, you know. And if we ever want to, you know, criminally prosecute people committing crimes in the financial markets, we do need their cooperation, because we would never really catch them just by their number. There's also corruption, for example. Corruption is sometimes called a victimless crime, because nobody's there to complain about it, because it's just two sides dealing with each other, and each one profits from it. So we need kind of people working with us, exposing these crimes, bringing them to light. Otherwise, we will never get to them. And what we see there, and I'm actually going to this, like the extreme, which is the idea of whistleblowing, where you bring that information, you tell on somebody, you tell the prosecutor, you know, this crime is going on, when nobody even knew about the crime. That's whistleblowing, and sometimes they get off free, sometimes a largely reduced sentence. And there we see that individuals sometimes get into these organizations, maybe a company or something that's doing something bad, and they just get in it, and maybe they become guilty of crimes because, you know, they don't want to, you know, they go along with it, they don't really think about it. It gets worse and worse. It's like the frog in the hot water. You kind of don't notice it until you're so guilty, and once you're guilty, you have to stay in it because you're guilty. You'd be punished for it. And we think they believe that by offering them this chance to get out once the morality kicks in, once they notice the bubbles rising around them in the water, that we are actually doing something very, very much in favor, very favorable to our society by allowing them to get out of that, tell us about it. Now, you know, as we heard, you know, so of course, and the second prop might be talking about that. Sometimes these people are just acting in their self-interest. And like we said, we really don't care. As long as they are helping society, they are righting the moral wrong they have participated in before that. That means they're doing something good, whereas before they did something bad. They are lessening the moral burden on them, and we should recognize them and reward them for it by reducing their crime, their punishment. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what we get from side government today is that if I kill a man and 10 people will profit from that and only 5 people will mourn, that is an acceptable action because it is beneficial to the society. But we inherently disagree with that. So what I will talk to you today about is firstly about the moral dimension of this debate, which has been extensively talked through in the first half of this debate. Secondly, I will talk about the practicalities that the second speaker of opening opposition brought on. And then I would like to work on this idea that was only briefly mentioned in a sentence by the opening government, namely that the crimes which are concerning this motion are mostly those which are very severe, and I will talk about that in terms of closure for the victims, etc., etc. So, getting to the point of morality. So the opening government brings up a case saying that punishment should be uniform for everyone. That punishment should be the same for the same crime. Now, what we get from the side opposition is basically a very pragmatical response that if society benefits as a result of that, the punishment does not to be uniform. But we inherently disagree with that because that goes against principle of every democratic society with an organized legal system, where the same crime, the same action, action A, should lead to a consequence X, no matter the perpetrator, no matter who has committed the action A, the consequence should always be X, no matter what. Most or practically every democratic country in the world has this principle embedded in their constitutions because we hold it so dearly, because it is the way we organize our society in a fair manner. Now, then they come up here, then they come further on, no thank you, and say that they are actually the ones who are moral, no thank you, because they are practically promoting something which benefits the society. They are promoting actions which are beneficial to the society as a whole. And then I asked the second speaker in my POI whether he would support something which will bring benefits to the most people of the society, even though some will be harmed. And he says yes. So we basically see that the underlying principle of the opposition's case is utilitarianism, a stream of thought inside philosophy of ethics, which basically claims that if action A brings more benefits than harms, it is legitimate. But as I have already pointed out in my introduction, this idea is inherently false, because if I commit a genocide, for example, and that benefits more people than it hurts, that is under opposition's idea of thought, under opposition's logic, a legitimate thing. If, for example, we say that 70% that we take away money from the 30% of the most wealthy people in the society and give it to the 70% which are less prosperous, that is okay under their system of thought, under their principle, because we benefit the most, because we benefit the biggest part of society and the smallest gets hurt. Yes?
So if I steal money and then give it back, should I be punished the same as if I don't give it back?
I don't see how that has anything to do with utilitarianism. I don't see how that has anything to do with your case. You had your time to explain it, you wasted it. So this point, I'll consider this point irrelevant. So getting on to the point, once we have already dealt with this morality, that the basic idea, that basic principle on which their case is based is flawed, let's get to the practical implications they have brought up. Now, they basically said that we are talking about crimes where we cannot get perpetrators any other way as with testifying, as with people testifying. Specifically, they talk about white-collar crimes, and they talk about crimes in the shadows, as they call it, organized crimes. And they say that specifically in the case of organized crime, there is no way we can get to people otherwise. But we say that is simply false. We still have telephone records, which they say we don't have. We still can have, for example, letters. We still have spies, for example, which spy on these people, because more often than not, those organizations which work underground, more often than not, they engage in in selling drugs. So seeing a man on the street selling drugs and then chasing him or spying on him for the next half year can bring you to the core of the criminal organization, if there one exists. So yes, there is a way to get to those people otherwise. And then they talk about white-collar crime, how it is impossible to get to them if we don't have someone from the inside. But this is inherently flawed. Why? Because then only those who've been actively engaged in a crime could be able to report it. And if we cannot get anyone who was actively engaged in a crime by their logic, then we cannot get anyone either way, because no one will testify if they profit from that crime. So we basically see that their idea of white-collar crime, or actually how do we solve it, is inherently flawed and untrue, because we do have white crime solved and they are not so impossible to get. No, thank you. Now, moving on to this idea of closure, to this idea of how very relevant cases, big cases, are important in terms of treatment of cases. How do we treat cases? So what we are basically saying is that such mechanisms as proposed today, as proposed to be banned today, are very often used not only in the small crimes such as about which the opposition was talking, but also in crimes such as genocide. For example, where there are two generals which were in charge of the military, and they offer a smaller sentence to general on one side as to the one on the other, in order for one to testify. Now, if we have two different cases where one was able to testify and get smaller punishment, and another case when there was where he had no information so he could testify, we see that is very important, not only under the principle of equality of punishment, but because people who have been affected by those crime victims, mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters of people who have been slaughtered, do not get the same degree of closure as the others one do. We do not see any rationale why a Bosnian mother is not entitled to the same amount of closure as the mother of a man who has been slaughtered in Rwanda. This is something that today's closing opposition has yet to explain. Why, in cases of such terrible atrocities, there is something under their model that justifies mothers not getting closure. Thank you so much.
Ready? Ready?
Thanks to the member of the proposition. I'll look forward to the member of the opposition.
A 3-year-old child picks up a gun, not knowing what it is, and accidentally shoots another child. According to the proposition, that child should go to jail for the same amount of time as an adult serial killer who also murders someone. That's what they're saying. A leads to X. This crime, no matter what the context, no matter what the person, no matter what the motive, should lead to this punishment. They say all societies are built on this idea. Thank goodness they are not. Thank goodness the proposition is wrong, and that logic is dangerous. We care about the context of a crime. We care about the holistic picture of what happened, which is why, for example, when 2 bank robbers rob a bank, one of them just wants to get the money and leave, but the other one wants to hold victims captive, torture them, kill them. prosecutors should be able to let the 1A off with a lesser charge in order to make sure that B goes to jail for a long, long time. No. They talked about the principle of sort of the crime. But we think that prosecutors should have the discretion to figure out what charges they want to bring people forward to. They talk about judges as sort of being the proper ones for having this role. They don't say why. They talk about sort of racial prejudice, but they don't say why judges would be immune to that. Judges are people too. If there's racial prejudice involved, judges are just as likely to have those issues. And there's already this sort of precedent for a difference, in the sort of treatment of a certain crime. For example, in sentencing, judges already have the ability to give a sort of lesser sentence if they think it's appropriate, but they are constrained by a sort of barriers on either side in terms of a sentence, and the prosecutor can work with the system to make sure that the person gets the appropriate punishment. So what would happen if this did come to pass? And my sort of two main points of extension are going to be that this sort of implies a fundamental distrust in the state, and this would result in sort of dangerous criminals being let loose, sort of the detriment of the general population, and more petty criminals in jail, also to the detriment of the general population. So first of all, they sort of talked about why don't we care about closure for the victims? Because prosecutors are not vigilantes. They don't represent the victims, they represent the state. They are the representatives of the state, and the state is supposed to impose justice. That is their role. The police and prosecutor work together to make sure that people who commit crimes are appropriately punished. There's no benefit to allowing what they suggest, the sort of like lying. What did they say? That they suggest we might blame anyone for anything. That's a direct quote. That doesn't generally happen because there's no benefit in a prosecutor, the police, the judge just having like non-criminals or having criminals sending non-criminals to jail, which is why this doesn't generally happen. They're also forgetting about the fact that that's a crime called perjury, which is another reason why that doesn't generally happen, that people are not allowed to lie, and they could be prosecuted if they do so. So they fortunately sort of brought no empirical evidence to support this idea of lying. And there isn't any. Actually, to the contrary, the evidence shows that when DNA evidence is introduced, which we sort of generally take to hold as sort of a standard of truth these days, it's usually, I think it's like 99.9% correct. When it's introduced later in a case, it generally shows that the defendant, the person that the prosecutor was already prosecuting, is guilty. So statistically, it is shown, basically what I'm saying is prosecutors generally get it right. They generally have the right person, and they're generally doing the right thing. Why do we want to take away this role from the state and their representatives that they're doing a good job prosecuting? Briefly.
Generally, yes, but even if we have one exception where justice is not met, we say that is wrong.
Okay. I mean, there are sometimes exceptions in every case. We're sort of looking at generally what is best for society, and this is clearly not it. So sort of on to my second point, which is this would result in serious criminals more likely to be set free, and lesser criminals, petty criminals, more likely to be in jail, right? Because if you take away the opportunity for people to testify against bigger criminals, for bank robber A to testify against bank robber B, it's harder to get bank robber B, right? There's less evidence, fewer witnesses, whatever. Like it's more evidence to prosecute bank robber B. Then you end up with bank robber A being in jail for the same amount of time, so you end up with bank robber B in jail for less amount of time, less likely that he will be prosecuted and convicted successfully. And it's more likely that bank robber A, the one who just wanted to grab the money and go, is now in jail for, murders. So why do we care, this sort of distortion of the justice system? I don't really want more dangerous criminals on the street, right? Like, I think we should try to be safe. We should try to have a society where people can walk around and not feel scared that people are going to attack them, right? All sorts of things that happen when you just have like rampant criminals on the street without the proper justice system. Why do I care if lots of petty criminals go to jail for longer times? I care about that too, right? Because it's really expensive. Not only is it sort of a violation of their rights if they should not be in jail for that amount of time, but it's really expensive for the state. In the US, for example, 20 million people are incarcerated, and it's $68 billion a year to keep them in jail. I'm sorry, I don't know the UK statistics. My apologies, but I hear it's a problem here too. So we should try to be incarcerating fewer of these petty criminals. It's a waste of money. We could be using that money for education, for healthcare, for lots of other social services, rather than having more petty criminals in jail. So basically we have, if this motion were to pass, we have less safety, more money for more incarceration because it's harder, because now you are not able to have lesser sentences for people who deserve lesser sentences. So it's wasting money, as well as you're sort of taking a role away from the state that they're doing well. So from this side, we have no empirical evidence, unsupported facts just being thrown out, whereas we have empirically demonstrated that this is a dangerous motion. Thank you.
There are strange things coming from side opposition today, because they have these various justifications as to why it's really important that we negotiate with people who have committed a crime, who have done a social harm and have, as a result of that, created victims who needed to be in the process of the justice being served, need to be reconciliated, and need to have closure. And this is what we on Closing Government stand for. We stand for the closure that we are taking away in the status quo by giving some crimes, by making some crimes less important than the others, but by making some victims look less important than the others just as a result of giving more attention to some particular cases than the other. What we get from side opposition is a case that tries to solve crimes that we cannot see and will then magically be solved. On the other hand, we get a justification because we save money. We believe that all these various justifications just don't make any sense whatsoever. So let's go through some of the points of rebuttal of the extension that has been brought up and then ask two fundamental questions. Firstly is, do we solve more crimes? And secondly, what happens to the victims, right? So without any further ado, let's just take a look at the extension that side closing has brought up. They say dangerous people are going to be loose, right? Because if we start not negotiating with people who have committed crimes, and this goes against what what opening opposition has been talking about when they say, we're not talking about people who are committing dangerous crimes. We're talking about people committing crimes such as white-collar crime, crimes such as corruption, right? And then all of a sudden we get a closing opposition which talks about very dangerous people going and robbing banks and killing people, right? We think they need to get their stuff straight and go with the line and with the cases that make sense. Second point is, they say it creates a distortion because it leaves petty criminals longer in jail, and people that commit horrible crimes, they stay in jail for a shorter time. But this just doesn't make any sense, because under the status quo, people who commit serious crimes get a shorter stay in jail as a result of the negotiation process that happens, right? If we have, for instance, somebody, or rather two people who have committed very serious crimes, and one testifies against the other who, for just a small nuance, has created a bit more severe of a crime, they still get a lot less time in jail in order for them to testify against the other. And we say, as a result of that, they stay in the jail for a shorter period of time. We don't see how their extension makes any sense. And secondly, they bring us this problematic of how petty criminals stay in jail for a longer period of time. And we say this policy doesn't solve that, because problem here is not in the distortion that is created, but it's in the absolute terms for the petty crimes. The issue that they have with the Americans staying too long in jail has to do with the fact that the sentences themselves are set to be too high, not because we are negotiating with high-profile criminals. We just don't think this makes any sense, right? And so we see, as a result of that, side-closing government had, first of all, put a huge knife in the opening opposition, and side-closing opposition stabbed a huge knife in the opening, and second of all, they make claims that don't really make any sense, right? They accuse of us that we're saying that it's the same effect if a child kills somebody or an adult kills somebody. And we're saying that simply isn't the case. It's important, the context is important, don't get me wrong here. But it's important, but what we also need to take into account what happens after the crime, right? When a crime has been done, it's that what is important. And they're just trying to mischaracterize that on that issue. And before I move forward, I'll be willing to make POI.
Okay, so yeah, the way the model was presented is that it's all criminals, which includes white collars and criminal defendants. And also, they seem to be stabbing their model by saying lesser sentences, what? Jail time? Lesser sentences means less jail time.
Yeah, exactly. And you're saying this happens in your model, whereas that this happens when you oppose the motion, whereas on the other hand, we're saying it's happening in the status quo once we negotiate with people and give them lesser sentence. So I don't see how your POI makes any sense whatsoever, right? Moving on to the important question, do we solve more crimes? On the government, we has presented you with a clear case of where we actually might solve more crimes, but we are not really sure if those crimes really are solved properly. We have given you quite a lot of objections when it comes to people falsely testifying, right? And side opposition comes up and says, well, that's perjury, that's illegal, right? Yeah. This is probably why people are in the court in the first place, because they have committed a crime, right? So they could just as well commit a perjury as well. And when it comes to opening opposition, they say, we're going to solve crimes that we never knew existed in the first place, right? So what they say here is, these people become the sole bearers of truth. So how do we really know that they are telling it if we have no other way of making sure that it's actually factually true, right? And we say this really is problematic if we oppose this policy and if we allow to negotiate with these people. And we say we should oppose it. Now, the second issue that is important here is what happens to victims, right? This issue really is important because what we have seen in instances of court session going on is prosecutor putting more emphasis on certain crimes than on the others, and putting more emphasis on particular perpetrators than the others. For instance, if a criminal gang, a drug gang, kills a black kid in some bad area, right? They're going to get lots less emphasis if a member of the same gang is going to shoot the mayor's son or a politician's son, right? So that man who has killed that black kid on the project and knows and has witnessed the other murder of the politician's child will get a free out of jail card, despite the fact that he's killed somebody, because he will be testifying against the other guy, against the other member, against the other gang member who has killed the politician's son, because of the high-profile case, right? And we say this is inherently unjust to the victims, to the mothers of their sons, of their families, and we say, as a result of that, we should apply this principle generally, right? That all the victims should get as much attention and as much justice as possible. And I beg you to support the victims. Thank you.
The opposition team supports a fair criminal justice system and rejects the dangerous and drastic measure that the proposition wants to be taking on the criminal justice system that we have in the status quo. We support reducing sentences and charges against criminals in exchange for testimony. And this is of the utmost importance, and I will explain this to you by answering two main questions as I summarize the debate that we have just had. The first question is, how is evidence used in criminal law? The second question is, how do we create a fair criminal justice system? And I will use the arguments and interweave them into my answers for these questions to kind of analyze the claims brought by the proposition and the opposition. So the first, and also before I go into doing that, I just wanted to clear up something that I think was pretty well answered in a POI about the knife, the imaginary knife that seemed to be magically brought into the room, and cover up that there are different types of criminals. This motion clearly is about different types of criminals. The proposition team talked about some. We also talked about some. I think that's very fair in the rules of BP debate. So now, on to my first question about how evidence is used in criminal law. The proposition seems to believe that this is somehow going to be creating a lot of false testimony. And they did this by giving us no examples about how this is a major problem in the status quo, because this is the system that we're currently using. And they didn't really kind of give us any links and analysis besides the fact that there would be this major incentive for them to give false information. Well, I think my partner pretty well debunked this idea by explaining that this is perjury and prosecutors are representing the state, and it is not in their interests at all to be incorporating this evidence. And additionally, evidence used in cases is used holistically. It's not like one individual's testimony rests on an entire case. No, I think this is a huge distortion and just relies on assumptions that the proposition is making and a lot of sheer ignorance about how testimony is used. We do not base evidence in the criminal justice system on one individual. We use DNA, as my partner was talking about. We use fingerprints, we use other individuals' testimony, and this is kind of a comparative analysis. And these individuals' testimonies are very important. They are a very important piece of this holistic analysis. And if we don't use them, as we are in the status quo, there are major ramifications to this, which my partner pointed out, and has major ramifications on the criminal justice system, which I will get into in just a moment. I can take your point.
But opening opposition talked about solving the crimes that we otherwise wouldn't be able to solve as a result of the testimony of these people. You are now declining that those options exist.
No, there's no difference or contradiction within that. The opposition talked about how this evidence is used to help fight organized crime, and we're not at odds with that. We believe that it can be used for that as well, and we support that. Again, it kind of goes into this holistic idea of how we fight crime. So answering my next question, and how we create a fair criminal justice system. The claims brought forth by the proposition, the second proposition speaker was that we should really rely on judges, and that they are those who are responsible. But I think this is a huge misconception in how the criminal justice system works. Prosecutors are representatives of the state, and it is their responsibility to be analyzing information, looking at evidence. They play a huge role in fighting in ensuring that we have criminal justice, and one way in which they do that is they use testimonies and they exchange reduced sentences in order to achieve this, and we think that is good. We think that it is helping us fight crime in the status quo, and the reality is that we wouldn't be able to fight a lot of crime without doing this, and we trust prosecutors to do this, and that's why we enable to do it now. The proposition has given us no real harms for why this is bad, for why it should just be the judge's role. That is not how crime works, how fighting crime works. So the other argument that they gave you is this kind of really vague and convoluted idea about the uniformity of law. Well, we are by no means against with the uniformity of law, and I think my partner very well explained this. We're not changing laws. It's still illegal to kill someone. It's still illegal to rape someone. And We're not in any way changing laws. There is different evidence used in different cases because there are different people involved in those crimes. So there's no way creating a new standard of how we do this. And the only kind of reason that the proposition gives to the importance of uniformity of law, no kind of analysis or examples, but rather this idea that somehow victims of crimes are going to be harmed because there's not this same degree of closure, we think is just not very true. And it's not the same. I mean, this already happens in law that we contextualize different crimes. And this is what my partner pointed out, and that the contextualizing something, especially when we're talking about crimes, which are very diverse, is very important. So this idea of the uniformity of law, the opposition completely wins. And so onto the extension that was brought forth by the opposition, by my partner, I just want to summarize it a little bit because I think this clearly shows where the opposition wins today. If we do this, what are the consequences? Well, we tell you that the consequences are dangerous because if we take this measure proposed by the opposition, we will not catch as many criminals and it will be dangerous for society. This is how we are able to prosecute many criminals in the status quo, and we do not want crime on the streets. Another ramification of it is, and it's not a contradiction as the proposition kind of falsely claimed it to be, is that if we did this, there would be longer crimes for many criminals who don't deserve those crimes, for petty crimes, and we believe this is very problematic. So you can make a decision today. You can either choose to support a kind of empty, non-substantive gesture that will cause bad change, or you can choose to fight organized crime and for a fair criminal justice system. Thank you.